This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives. Valerie, welcome to This Restorative Justice Life. Who are you?
My first identity as Valerie was as a daughter to little Jack and Joy, sister to Victoria, and then a partner to Craig, and a mother to Jenna, Emma, Brandon, Garrett, and Grant, and then a grandmother to Silas. So I am this particular white-bodied, spirit-embodied woman, full of my particular DNA strands and collective DNA that create and mutate and shapeshift who I am in this lifetime. And I am more than me. So I am shaped by the relationships with people in my family, my friends, those who I've just passed by in the street, those who I've learned from, those who I've been wounded by, and by the ecosystems and creatures and biomes that I have lived in and that I currently live in. And so I also carry with me into this lived experience of Valerie, as well as those that came into this lifetime with me.
Who are you?
I am also a descendant and an ancestor. And I am a descendant of the people that we call Celtic, who spread across Western and Northern Europe, that I can trace back to the 12th century and then across the ocean to what is now the United States. Those ancestors who brought their own traumas and cultural oppressions and displacements by empire, and their resilience and their wounds and their pioneering spirit. And I carry the complexity of these ancestors who also inflicted further harm and trauma and displacement, and worse, on people who are indigenous to this land and on the bodies of Black people as slaveholders. And so within me is this complexity of DNA and of roles and of harms that have been caused and harm causing. And so I bring with me this past lived experience of both oppressed and oppressor, of those who have perpetrated violence and have experienced violence at the hands of others. So I am this metamorphosis of changing and transforming identities that is never static.
Who are you?
And I am also a descendant of the Atlantic Ocean and the Rhine River and the stones and the minerals of the British Isles and the fungal spores and trees of ancient oaks and alder, of the highlands, of rocky shores and forests, and then of the Potomac and James rivers of what became Virginia, and of the Duck River in Tennessee, and the Hudson River and Lake Erie in the Pacific Ocean, and sagebrush in canyons, I currently live in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, where my ancestors settled in the 17th century. But I'm also a transplant from California. I'm now part of this land with this complex lineage. And I live on this land of the indigenous Siouan, Algonquian, and Haudenosaunee communities who lived here for generations prior to European settlement. And so I'm a descendant of both place and people.
Who are you?
I am a convener and a weaver, a listener and a seer. I believe that the spiritual realm that surrounds us, the unseen, the invisible, is just as real as the material world that we can see. And I work in these realms as a reconnector and an explorer of what is both ancient and emergent. Some of the questions that lead me is what can shift our perception? Because things are not what they seem on the surface. And so these parts of me find their way into my work as the vision animator for the Center for Art, Humor, and Soul, and the founder and facilitator of Shenandoah Valley Church of the Wild, and as a co-founder of the Wild Church Network. I'm also an eco-spiritual guide and a Gene Keys and Human Design guide, and an energy and Reiki practitioner. I like to play with language and words. It seems we are in such a time of radical shifting that the old language and the old ways just don't fit anymore, as a new story is being birthed. So I'm sitting with what is emergent and what language and what mythopoetic stories are wanting to come forth from the earth and from the cosmos through us and through all that we are interconnected with.
Who are you?
I'm also a student. I am a student of life, and the material of my learning is everything I come into contact with. My children, the trees, the birds, my cats, the events in the world, emotions, pain, the teapot, the invisible realms. And so I'm a scholar of my own life, and I listen deeply to the world around me and know that I am being listened to as well. And with or without words, and looking deeply beneath the surface of what we call reality. And I have a fascination with the invisible roots that might be causative factors of what we see on the surface of our lives as systems and structures. And so I'm fascinated by learning constantly, and I'm a bibliophile, so that's part of that always learning kind of orientation to life. My life and my rooms overflow with books and learning potentials, and also seeing learning as more than books too. My furniture and my desks and my dressers are also filled with stones and pieces of wood, and everything can be a source of learning.
Who are you?
So wrapping up these who are you questions, I am this finite body and particular personality and biography that is Valerie, with my own shadows and wounds and struggles and gifts and my own brand of genius. I think within each one of us, we have our own brand of genius that we bring and develop over our lifetimes. I am interconnected with the earth and all of her expressions, including the human and other creatures and plants and minerals and celestial bodies.
Right. Well, Valerie, thank you so much for sharing so many of the intersections of who you are. We'll be back to engage in all of those intersections right after this.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and today we are welcoming Valerie Luna Serrels to the podcast. Valerie is a weaver and synthesizer, a mother and a mystic. She is also an author of the chapter called Radical Relationalism, Restorative Justice with the Earth. She weaves together her background in conflict transformation and restorative justice with Celtic spirituality. This episode will come just in time for Earth Day. Valerie discusses the connections to restorative justice from birth and the importance of zooming out to see where we fit in the grander scheme of our Earth. Without further ado, let's get into it.
Welcome back, Valerie. It is so good to have you here. I must say, I believe you've broken the record for the most in-depth Who Are Yous, probably set by Ashley Ellis in episode 4. So congratulations on that. It's very good to have you here, especially on Earth Week. Behind the scenes for folks who listen to this podcast, sometimes I record podcasts much in advance, but this time we're actually recording during Earth Week when this podcast is being released, and I'm very excited to have this conversation on the intersection of restorative justice and the earth and nature and all the interconnections that we have with you. We heard so many things in your Who Are You questions that that are worth digging deeper into, especially when it comes to Church of the Wild and so many of those other things. But before all that, it's good to check in. So, to the full extent that you want to answer the question, how are you?
How am I? Yes. And I've been on other calls with people. We've been shifting the word "how are you" to like "where are you?"
Mm-hmm.
And not only where are you located physically, but just where are you? What are you thinking about lately? And where does your mind go? Where is your heart located? What is causing you to rethink things and dive deeper? And that how can be part of that as well. So right now I find myself feeling pretty good. Our household consists right now of 5 adults in different stages of life, which is really fascinating. People coming and going. My mother, my one of my adult daughters, and my sister who's just moving, and my partner and I. So we just had a case of COVID come through, but it didn't infect all of us, just one. So I'm grateful for that, and feel present and here, and grateful to be spending this time with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Not only is this, super fortuitous that, we are having this conversation around Earth Week, Earth Day. This is also the first conversation that's airing featuring contributors to the book, Listening to the Movement, essays on new growth and new challenges in restorative justice. This was put together by Ted Lewis and Carl Stauffer. You'll be hearing from many of the other contributors in the coming months on this podcast, on these airwaves. But your chapter in the book was about radical relationalism, restorative justice with the earth. Before we get into the depths of the chapter, I want to ask, and this is where we start many of our conversations on this podcast, you've been doing this work around quote unquote restorative justice for a long time, before you were at EMU and probably before you even knew the word restorative justice. So how did this journey get started for you?
Origin stories are always hard, aren't they?
Sure.
Because where does something actually begin? Yeah, I hadn't heard the term restorative justice before. I started my master's program at the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University in 2007. I was an older student returning to school, was in my 40s. intrigued by peace building and conflict transformation. I had been in the midst of mothering full time, my 5 kids for some reason, and we lived in California at the time. And whatever we were going through then, I felt compelled to uproot my family from California and head out to Virginia for this program. And we've stayed here, and it felt kind of random, but there was really this really strong pull that I couldn't really rationalize or make sense of. But my husband was game and the kids were excited. So we packed up, all of us, with our 2 cats and our dog, and made our way east. And so it wasn't until I was in school that I heard the term restorative justice, and was drawn to it and attracted by it because of the principles and the rootedness in relationship, and just understanding ourselves as more than just I. And so bringing these principles together with sort of this changing orientation that I was going through. It was really a transformational time for me. After graduation, I worked in environmental and climate justice movement. It was really then that my theory of change began to change. I would have to go way back, because a lot of parts of me weren't really awake enough yet to, I was so caught up in motherhood and 5 young children. But at the heart of that is all about relationship. It's about conflict transformation. It's about how do you make a family with all of these different personalities and needs and wants and desires. And so that was kind of the soil of the growth of understanding the importance of the dynamics of relationship and looking deeply into what causes conflict and what we could pull out of those as sources of growth and coming together. And so to me, motherhood is one of the greatest challenges and the greatest schools of learning about ourselves and about the world. And so I could now see how we were already living restorative justice principles without having any idea what they were. And I was reflecting on this question about origins. If we go back far enough, we realize that relationship is at the core of who we are as creatures. It's in our cells, it's in our DNA. And there's something about understanding ourselves and each other as just these individuals that is inconsistent with the reality of our actual interconnectedness, or the fact that we are microcosms within macrocosms, and we aren't this one separate thing. Instead, we are shaped by environments and systems and ancestry, and even by the cells and microbes within our own bodies. So it's we can't just point to this one definition of who we are, because we are everything that we come in contact with. We in some senses there is no I and there is no other. And if we look at our evolution as humans, even as alive beings, and look at how life stems from these microscopic creatures who lived as solitary microbes for how many billions of years, and then whatever evolutionary pivot point was triggered, these microbes opened up beyond their own edges and began to relate to each other and absorb each other and metabolize each other and become new iterations of cellular life. And this kind of open relating and mutating became multicellular organisms. And by this miracle that is life, that is woven into salmon and fern and wolf and Neanderthal and modern humans, all of this happened because of the relationality and cooperation that exists at the core of what is life. There's both my story of beginnings of what led me, and also this overarching deep history story of how we are drawn toward relational qualities. We've been, because of Western culture and civilization and industrial civilization, we've kind of lost that knowing and understanding of how interconnected we are. In our longer history, there's something within us that knows. And so restorative justice is the principles behind it and underneath it, at the core of it, are essential to who we are as living beings. It's a really long answer to that question.
In the book, you talked about, as humans, our view of the earth and the value of the earth can be instrumental, right? Where we are extractive. How do we industrialize, use resources from the earth to produce goods, provide services, etc. It can be intrinsic, where we are, and I think this is where much of like the modern quote unquote conservationist movement fits in, where we see the earth and natural resources as valuable but still separate from us. But you've been talking about this idea of this deep interconnection, which, you know, we've talked about on these airwaves, about what restorative justice is for me, living into like values that indigenous people, no matter how far we go back, have held for so long, about, you know, it's not just being in right relationship with other people, but all beings. How do you conceptualize this radical relationalism as you've come to understand it?
Yeah, I came across the term by something I read by Professor Barbara Buraca in Oregon. And when I read that, something just really clicked, the way she wrote about it and the term itself. And the more I sat with it, the more it really did also bring to mind, obviously, the lives and practices and ways of being and understanding of Indigenous peoples, you know, including our own Indigenous histories. So there's, I think to name it is really important, because what we might be calling radical, this term radical relationalism, you know, might just be just the way things are for many Indigenous people. So it's radical in some ways because it challenges the way we understand this, the way we have lived out this division between the human and non-human world, and then coming to see it as illusory, that it's an illusion, that separation that we have been taught. And this new story about radical relationism kind of restores our identities as people, creatures of the earth. So many times we center humans as because of so many different streams of Western thought that has created a human-centric world. But this is an invitation to revisit that notion and to reconnect with our primary belonging as creatures and beings of the earth herself, that we are an expression, the human expression of the earth, just as an oak is an oak expression of the earth. Or it repositions the human within a larger story of billions of years of an earth, acclimating and learning and being resilient in the face of so much change, environmental change, even before human beings. And the intelligence of a billions of year old organism is something that in our current state as humans, we can't access by ourselves. And so in this relationalism, to me, it is an invitation to open, to listen, to receive, to approach anything in the natural world as an intelligent, alive being. And to know that there is intelligence in everything. And even in the invisible, we are surrounded by intelligence that we don't access as part of our daily lives. And So that's part of what has led me into the work that I do, is knowing that this big change that we are in, this paradigm shift, the collapse of industrial civilization that is coming, that we are seeing maybe beginning stages of. We can't work our way into a new world, into a new way of being with the earth, without going through a process of learning to listen and know in different ways that isn't just from our logical, rational, linear minds, but that is developed through a deeper listening from our heart centers, from our intuitive knowing, from the more feminine qualities that have been suppressed and repressed and oppressed for hundreds of not more years. That way isn't really taught so much in schools. It's something that mystics and spiritual people who are spiritually oriented have sought out, because I feel like there is something coming that is integrative, that is wanting to bring together what we've developed as far as our brains throughout evolutionary history with our spiritual knowing, and through our emotional intelligence, and through our relationality with the earth. Developing these other senses feels, and I don't go into a lot of this directly in this chapter, but that feels like a big part of what this relationality means, at least to me, is not just from the cognitive center, how we have centered our cognitive awareness, but is also from our sensory awareness, and is from just the felt sense within, and from our presence that we are in relationship to all that is, whether it's with another person or with a stone or sitting by a river or wherever our lives lead us. But it feels, using the word radical makes sense to me, because we are in this time of such shifting that we don't even know how to talk about new ways of being and belonging. The lexicon that we've developed that is mostly, Eurocentric, and the language that we use can't quite cover or speak to what is wanting to emerge. Trusting something other than our minds to figure things out is a big leap for many of us. It is for me. And it's a process of trusting the earth, trusting that there's a deeper intelligence, that there's wisdom in our own bodies and in the body of the earth, acclimating to that, and building community from that, so that it becomes a learning community together, into depths and spaces and fields of knowing that we aren't quite familiar with, and that can be uncomfortable. I think challenges the way we have valued, and the values that we put on all of life, including the earth, but each other and ourselves, and the way we respond to the world around us. All of this feels like it's shifting and changing to something that is more organic and wild, and depends on our actual interconnection and relating in a different way.
When I hear the word radical, right, a lot of times you're immediately drawn to like, oh, the thing that's far out there, not mainstream. And if we go like, how much more Eurocentric can you get than going to like Latin, right, the language? And in Latin, like the roots of the word radical actually means to the root, right? Or stemming from the root, proceeding from the root. And so like in a lot of ways, radical relationality, right, is about returning to the roots of our relationships with each other, with the earth, in all of the ways that you talked about what it takes to develop this sense of relationality, because it is so oppositional to the way most of life in the United States, land that's now called the United States that we are, Western world, um, capitalistic, driven by capitalism. Uh, it, Late stage global capitalism has divorced us far from those roots, right? How do you, or how does one build this consciousness?
I think that it's already in us. And so it feels more like a remembering
Mm-hmm.
than it is like a conjuring or steps 1, 2, 3. It feels much more um, wild than that. It's like we can't domesticate that or make it happen. It's something that we open to. That's what it feels like to me. And basically that's what Church of the Wild is for me. I know there's many different ways that people practice and orient in the many different wild churches that are out there. But for me, that feels like the root of it is remembering our actual rootedness and our histories are now as people of interconnection. So it's taking time, it's pausing, it's seeing being unproductive as sacred. It's seeing in the midst of so much change, stopping and listening and noticing our breath and noticing our bodies. It's an embodied process, and the wisdom that connects us into that deeper wisdom and into the rootedness of our ancestry, or our rootedness as beings of the earth, comes from that kind of stopping and pausing and embodiment. Often one of the first things we do at a gathering is to notice how outside ourselves we are, how externalized we are from our own selves, and taking time to sink into our senses, both our 5 senses, what we are seeing, what we are hearing, feeling, tasting, touching, what is here right now. And then also developing our inner sensing by closing our eyes and sensing our own awareness and our own presence, and bringing it down deeper into our bodies and just noticing what is there. To notice the miracle of our own body's functioning and of the breath, and also of just the energy that flows through us and around us, that so that we are more aware of body sensations inside, of energy flowing within us, where we might feel stuck, where we might feel flow, and acknowledging through our feet and through our legs just the multitude of ancestors right beneath us who are native to this land, whether those are creatures or people or tree roots, that we stand, sit, already connected. And it's bringing our awareness, it's shifting our awareness from our heads and our to-do lists and our strategies and our, am I doing this right? And noticing where we are right now. What emotions are we feeling? What are we feeling in our bodies? And being present with ourselves and each other and this particular place where we are, that has its own life and motion and intelligence. So it's a really, if I had to kind of summarize it for me, it's like the shift from the head into the heart and into the body. And to know that that we are held by the earth, that we are held by that which holds the earth, and that we are supported at all times. And it's just a shift in awareness. That sounds simple. And I know there's more to it than that, but that is basically what it is to me.
Yeah. There was a piece in there where if you had changed we to you, it was almost like a guided meditation, an invitation to embodiment in any given moment. So if folks want to rewind back a couple minutes and just take that moment to practice that awareness of where you are, as you shared before, in your body, maybe if you're outside in the world, there's an invitation for you to do that. Second, I was observing in myself, and I've been observing in myself this entire time, the much slower pace that this conversation is going than is my normal, and that is quote unquote normal, typical of this podcast. And already in my mind, I was thinking like, hey, Elise, when you edit this, edit it at like put it out at like 1.1 speed, right? So like we're saving people time, we're getting people through the content. And because in many ways this podcast is a product for consumption, right? And people's time is valuable. Time is a non-renewable resource, if you will, if you're thinking about things linearly, which we'll get to when we talk about quantum physics in just a little bit. Time is limited, and as somebody who hosts this podcast, puts this product out into the world, invites people to engage with these ideas, I want people to be able to consume, right? Get through this, digest, embody, embrace, both intellectually and within their own body, in an efficient manner. What you just talked about, and like what I've been fighting this whole entire time, is like, all right, yeah, and like already thinking like forward to the listening experience of a consumer. So Elise, you get to leave this in here, because I think this is a valuable part of the conversation. But what I'll say in like direct response to the content of what you shared is, it does sound simple, but so are so many different practices that we talk about. What you talked about sounds like embodiment practice. It sounds like mindfulness. It sounds like meditation. It sounds like so many things that different people prescribe, but all it takes to do those things is the practice, and it's not practicing it perfectly every single time. It's about building that practice. We're right now in the middle of this restorative justice training camp, and where every week for 6 weeks we have produced video lessons for people to engage in. There are challenges, and then we come and huddle up on Saturdays, using the metaphor of like a workout training camp kind of thing. And when I think about how do people get strong, how do you build muscles? It's by doing your exercise, eating nutritious food, and taking rest when you need it. That is very simple, right? But it's just like discipline to do it, right? And like what you're talking about is the discipline to do it. Similarly, when we're talking about restorative justice, like there's only as many. There are many ways to quote unquote restorative justice, but what we're really talking about is being in right relationship. Mm-hmm. Edward Valandra, who was on a couple episodes back, talks about, the charge of the Great Spirit, from his Lakota perspective, was, to be a good relative and to do no harm. Yeah. That's it. And those are simple things, and the systems and structures that we live in make those things a little bit more complicated for mm-hmm. us. I guess for you, what helped you step out of those constructs
Mhm.
to the extent that you have, right? Because you're
Right.
still an active participant in
Oh yeah.
capitalism
Oh yeah.
and all of these systems and structures, but like, what has helped you step out of that?
I feel like I've been led into this different way of being. And yes, it starts as, practices, but really it's a way of being in the world. And I also feel like this is inside each one of us. And so there's, for me in my life, there's trigger points. There's like parts of my life that changed and kind of had this radical, there it is again, trajectory of change, of movement toward a different way of understanding the world and myself and others, and even God, or what we call God or spirit. And most of those trigger points were actually points of shock. They were points of wounding. And so out of this wounding came a process of being pulled to almost out of necessity. And I've become kind of an evangelist for within the wound is the gift, because it's just so true that those can be doorways, or just as gigantic doorways of invitations, just like any conflict is as well, of opportunity, of learning to sit in the discomfort, to sit in the unknowing, to be knocked senseless in a way, to provide the space for something new to come forward. And so as part of this, what I see and kind of call emergence, because I don't have another word for it, as this moving, flowing state of change that is coming forward at all times. Sometimes we catch glimpses of it and we can give it words. Kind of opposed to the just the day-to-day practice of Western culture, progress, go out and be effective and do your part and pay your bills and go to bed and wake up and do it all over again. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, and that there is this certain continuity in that. That is just part of what we need to do to have lives in this time. But when we can extricate ourselves from that, even just a little bit of knowing that we are more than that, knowing that there's a deep purpose within us that may not equate to the ways that we are kind of locked into our functioning. And it seems like it's the time of unfunctioning and unknowing and unlearning and questioning that is the place of just potentiality, of possibility, of learning something you didn't know before about yourself or about the world. And sometimes those can be shocking. Sometimes they can be extremely uncomfortable. Sometimes these can be moments of maybe even extreme joy or awe, something that kind of kicks us out of our habitual ways of being and doing in the world. And hearing that call, it's almost like something we can't make happen even. So I don't know how helpful that is, but just being aware that there's more. You are more than you think you are. Life is more than we think it is. There's so much rich possibility of the way we organize ourselves as human beings and the way we are in relationship. Those big, deep shifts come out of times of suffering or pain, and which is, we each carry that in us through our lived experiences. We carry with us through our ancestry. And I'm not glamorizing trauma or making light of the difficulty of what suffering implies, but that within it is also the seed of transformation. And we are equipped as human beings because of our relationship, because of our being part of this miraculous earth and world. We are meant to metamorphosize. We are meant to metabolize and change and shift and evolve. And that trajectory of suffering and growth and it's not even a trajectory, it's a spiral. It is really forged through that universal principle of life, death, and rebirth. There's something that needs to die that is actually part of what new life is. So these are kind of concepts and ideas of things we don't really want to talk about. We don't want to acknowledge. We don't want suffering. We don't want death. We just want growth and progress and strategy. And so it's a very different way of surrendering to the principles of nature and of these universal truths of uncomfortable things that we don't necessarily want to invite into our lives. And I think so much that we're facing though right now as a culture and as a people and as a planet has to do with the avoidance of these things. Maybe coming back to simplicity, just being very present with our life, no matter what is there. If it's pain, be in the pain. If it's joy, be in the joy. Allowing that to do its work in us, in ourselves, to change our DNA, to release it to the earth, to be metabolized. So,
that surfaces for me another term that you brought up in your chapter, which was like grief restoration, right? Instead of restoration, restoration. Thinking about the story of what has happened, and like what is it that we're supposed to be learning. And again, not to glamorize, glorify the trauma, the hurt, the pain, but that can be such a healing thing. That can be such a restorative, if you will, process. What has that looked like for you? Is there a specific example that comes to mind?
And grief is like the flip side of joy or of love. You don't grieve if you haven't loved. So seeing the losses that I've had in my life and times of grief have involved some kind of ritual, have involved at least some kind of sitting with and allowing and acknowledging. And I've been drawn to the work of Frances Weller, who identifies our loss of connection with the earth as one of the most important gateways of expressing grief. So, during this time of so much collapse and extinction of species and collapse of ecosystems and climate change and all of that, I think a lot of what we are also feeling, because we are part of that, of the earth, and is the earth's grief. And so how are we also conduits of noticing how that not only impacts us, but what the earth is going through. I'll have to turn to Church of the Wild, because during the year, there's about 2 times during the year that I provide an open space to process grief. And I lean on a lot of Francis Weller's work because he names these 5 gates of grief that are just so real in our lives about our losses. And he specifically also names what if the grief that we feel is also the sorrow of the earth. And so creating spaces for grief during times of harm and injustice obviously can be part of that healing process, and part of the returning of ourselves back to the present moment of what we are experiencing now, instead of trying to dismiss what is there. And so there's a certain kind of reclaiming and restoration of our own selves as we kind of embody our grief and allow ourselves to feel what we feel. So providing spaces for grief, even as a cyclical part of the year, has become an important part of our gatherings, and bringing it back into community, because it used to be, for all of us in our ancestry, part of a communal ritual of expressing grief together.
Mm-hmm.
So it's getting back to some of that.
Yeah. Have you tapped into specifically your Celtic roots to process some of those things?
Yes, but I did what I knew I wanted to practice, an earth-based spirituality. I was very aware of appropriation and Native American traditions and spirituality, and so I spent a few years on my own genealogy and ancestral work, and that's when I really got in touch with my Celtic heritage. And so we practice based on the seasonal changes of the year and the Celtic wheel of the year, which includes this, very intimate relationship with nature, and kind of highlighting the human experience with what's happening in the natural world as well. So kind of this living according to what is both around us and in us at the same time, including grief. The October Celtic festival of Samhain is really about ancestors, and it's also about death and grief, and so bringing that back in the cycle of the year has helped, I think, just have this continuity with our own lives and with the passages of and losses that are inherent to being alive on this earth. So I also spent about 3 years at what was called the School for Celtic Consciousness. It was led by John Philip Newell. It's now called Earth and Soul, I think. And that's helped just ground me in the in my own lineage, and in awakening to really what's already in me, on a cellular level and in an ancestral lineage. And part of that is also, grieving both, what happened to, I don't know, specific stories that go back to, Roman conquest and all of that, but just really grieving both the oppression and eradication of, in Scotland and Ireland, and of the tribal peoples there, and also grieving that my ancestors who came here did the same thing to the peoples that were in here, already living here, the indigenous peoples here. So it's kind of grieving both of those, and the harm that was inflicted on, it's that perpetuating story of the harm that we that is inflicted upon us is the same harm that we then mete out on others who come across our path. So healing that harm causing, that's kind of that perpetuating cycle, I think has something to do with grieving that the losses that we also went through, and coming to a place of acknowledgement, so that grief and that acknowledgement go hand in hand, acknowledging the harm done.
I want to highlight for folks, you talked about not wanting to appropriate not wanting to appropriate from indigenous people here on Turtle Island. And that's such an important piece, right? I am in some ways a settler here, right? My people immigrated from the Philippines, and then my people were stolen from Western Africa. Um, and some of the ways that I learned restorative justice work, circle work, were from Indigenous people here in Canada, and those that have passed down those teachings, and those who have passed down these teachings from Lakota ways and um, from other Native folks to Turtle Island, right? But you talked about the years long process that it took to get to your roots, right? And that's a journey that I'm on. It's not an overnight process, right? For people like, oh, now I know how to do quote unquote restorative justice work from, Western African roots, right? Or from my traditional Filipino ways of being. It's a process of learning. And, as a 31-year-old person, most of my life has been spent separated from those ways of being. And so, it's an ongoing journey that we invite others to go on for themselves, right? It's not something that you like, hey, sign up for this course and
Right.
now you know your ancestry, but
Exactly.
finding elders who are in your community. It is easier now with the internet and Zoom and all these resources that people have produced. But thank you for sharing, going on that journey for yourself, because it is important, right?
Yeah. And I think what you just mentioned about, how there is no like 1, 2, 3 go kind of process. And how do we learn from our ancestral ways, especially those who were oral cultures. And so there's not a lot written down about things like this. And because of the interruption and separation of culture by empire throughout history, we've lost so much of that. But it's also lives in us. And so I just want to go back to that again, that it's in us. It's in our DNA. It's in the earth. There's memory within the earth. And so accessing what is in us, obviously knowing our ancestry can be helpful, but even if we don't know, we know that we are people of a particular place on this planet, and that we were formed by the earth and by certain people groups, but that we aren't just one clean, lineage. We are messy. We are an amalgamation of different places and times and people groups, and so I think just remembering that, as well as doing what we can to understand our own ancestral background. But even if we don't know, there is still ways of knowing that by accessing our own wisdom.
Yeah, that restoration of relationship with self is so important, right? Another part of what you contributed to this chapter is the restoration of relationship with the earth. You talked about how so much of quote unquote environmental legislation is about, this is the way that you can now damage the earth in this restricted way. Right? Not so much about like, this is how we heal, this is how we repair. What are some things that you've seen that have been more restorative, either here on this continent, on another continent, on both small scale and large scale governmental, corporate, communal efforts?
Yeah, you're pointing at why, one of the reasons I kind of left the quote, environmental movement, which was a lot of political involvement and, trying to change policy and direct action and lawsuits and just all of that. And I don't want to, those are important. I don't want to take away from
harm
the
reduction.
fact that, yes, harm reduction is part of it. And the other part, Joanna Macy names those three kind of ways of addressing and bringing forward that new story. And one of them is those holding patterns to stop destruction. The other one is, living into new ways of being and creating new systems. And then the third one is a shift in consciousness. And so all three of those are important. So I was mostly working at the direct action level. And for me, I just felt like I was we were beating our heads against the wall. And there just felt like there was something missing in this piece of, this external change that we all want to see. And we're well-intentioned by doing what we do. But I was led more toward a shift in consciousness, and which included actual relationship. And so as far as coming up with case scenarios of, things that have worked, I really can't think of a lot on, on the larger national level, other than there is a more conscious awareness of climate change and, environmental harms that we are doing daily. But as far as stopping those, I can't see that coming from that level. I see it from the grassroots level. Most of them have to do with, relationships and reacquainting ourselves with the earth. And I could pull from even the Wild Church Network, which is, there's probably 200 or so different communities that are in different stages of development across the United States and Canada. And some churches and leaders are doing actual, activism. They're getting in the way of pipelines, and they are, this is constant source of conversation about the interconnection between our internal lives and our spiritual selves and what we do in the world. And there's others that are less active in that way, but that are more about changing ourselves. And what some people may dismiss as maybe navel gazing or something like that can actually be more countercultural than we think, because of what we've talked about already, this kind of production-based, systemized way of doing, check off ABC and you've done a good job kind of thing. But this recentering of within ourselves and as not the main characters in the story. So recentering the earth as a central character and all the creatures as characters rather than just humans. One of my teachers, this is kind of an indirect example, but someone that I've been learning a lot from recently, his name is Bayo Kamalafe. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He's one of the animators and founders of the Emergence Network. And one of his leading questions is, what if the way we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis? So he brings like this spirit of inquiry into what are we actually doing? And when we try to address things, even as justice within a framework of, it's even a colonial framework of justice and injustice. So how do we...
something that's more transactional instead of relational.
Yeah. And that there's something outside of the traditional boundaries of what we have of agency and possibility that we are playing with, that we are being called to play with in a different way. And that's like this permission to fail, the permission to not know. There are organizations who are, directly working on harm causing, going to sit in areas of the earth, of our place, where we live, the ecosystems where we live, and knowing where there has been harm done, whether historically or now, clear-cut forests or poisoned watersheds, and going out to these actual places and having circle processes in them, bringing our presence to these places. And so this can be done at a very local level, and it can be done in larger levels, so that everyone is meeting at the same time across the globe to sit in wounded places and to create joy in those places. And so they can be places of grieving, but they can also be places of joy, where we bring symbols or gifts to the earth, where there might be dancing, where there might be singing, where there might be any number of communication and expression of solidarity with that piece of earth. And I actually I wrote this chapter many years ago. It was just published last year, but it was like a 3-year process. And as I was looking for, actual, states or municipalities or organizations who were doing this environment, approaching an actual environmental harm through restorative justice lenses, I really couldn't find too many. There may be, I remember one in Denver, and I can't remember the name of it, in Oakland, I think in Oakland, California. And I don't have that information on me right now. Bringing into actual litigation of harm to the earth to bring in restorative processes. But in the chapter, I outlined how that could be possible just from looking at other models in New Zealand and Australia specifically. But that, and even work that is being done around colonization, and as colonizers and settlers, that kind of work that Elaine Enns has been involved in and has written about, is also important work that is directly related to restorative justice with the earth, because it's all part of the same system and process. So it is being done in small ways. I think that can really impact things that I think we have in our minds, and the small things we do don't matter. But I think every small thing that we do with intentionality and love and presence actually does much more than we think. And we may not see results immediately, because we're kind of attuned to always wanting to have that kind of quick feedback, that what we do has an immediate resolve. But I don't think that's how life works, really. And it's like the I forget what that's called. I think there's a term for, like, when a butterfly falls in the rainforest of the Amazon. We experience that fall here in some way. So that
the butterfly effect, right?
Yeah. So I think that can be explained when I'm trying to say by that kind of effect, that everything we do actually does change this collective field.
Yeah. And I do want to highlight something that you shared about, there are, the work that people are doing to stop harm is so important, right?
Yes.
In order to have restorative processes between humans, right? We have to stop harm first, right?
Yes.
You're not going into a process of healing while somebody is actively causing you harm. Why would you do that in these circumstances that we're talking about? And so all of the efforts to stop harm to the environment are so needed. And what are the other ways that we can continue to orient towards healing, towards a new way? In some ways, I think about it as like, the proactive and responsive ways that we embody restorative practices, right? Not just like, I do want to like lift up like there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, but like
Right.
there are harm reductive ways to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But even within there are ways that we can even step out of the capitalist grind, and be slow, and be intentional and connect in different ways. That is both healing for us as people, but also treating the earth kindly as well. Um, and so that's an encouragement, that I have for folks who are listening.
Mm.
Um, I'm very, very aware of how much time we have, and I want to make sure that we get you to the questions that everybody answers. Like, we do have time, right? These constructs of um, urgency, and needing to produce and consume all the time, are made up. um, right? Like we can start to break from those, and like I know that gets like really really heady, maybe headier than you listening to this podcast we're expecting, but it's just like a really really um, important thing to ponder as we continue to, you know, live quote unquote this restorative justice life, but really build a better world for future generations, to have a world for future generations. um and there's so many things that we didn't get to touch on. This book, Listening to the Movement, is available for purchase, but Eastern Mennonite University has made the chapters available online, and so Valerie's chapter will be linked in the show notes, so you can dive into all the things that she's mentioned there. Lots of things that we didn't get to touch on, but I want to make sure that we have time to answer the questions that everybody answers when they come on this podcast. So, in your own words, define restorative justice.
Restorative justice is a return to our relational belonging and listening and treating each event in our lives as an opportunity to learn more about ourselves and about others.
Beautiful. As you've been going about this work and this work broadly, what has been an oh shit moment, and what did you learn from it?
It's interesting because both of the things that are coming forward right now, are more personal things and relational, and health kind of things. And both of them had to do with some kind of loss, because, well, one of them in particular that was relational had to do with trying to resolve something in a way that was more controlling. I was kind of leaning on things that I thought I knew, and the situation was calling for something of more letting go of something. So instead of listening to and trying to solve something in a traditional way, it wound up collapsing completely. So the lesson in it was about the importance of letting go of what I think I know, and really listening more deeply to what is being called for that is outside of my traditional ways of understanding and doing things. And so because of that, I lost an important relationship because I approached it in a way that was really more about releasing control and fixing something, rather than just sitting and being with the uncomfortability of it. That was a big oh shit moment when I realized that my efforts that were well intended didn't produce the results that I expected. And it had something to do with my own control and needing to release what I thought I knew.
Let go of control and problem solving said in the same thing. Like, those are different things. Like, let go of control seems to me a little bit like sitting in the uncomfortability, But how is that different for you?
I think it is. And I don't think it's different from problem solving. So instead of seeing, so it's kind of that linearity of
Okay.
here's this behavior that is problematic, or here's this thing that is problematic. And so to solve it, I need to do A, B, C. And I know what to do because here's the framework that I have to apply to this. But it didn't work in this situation. And so the letting go had to do with just sitting in it. Yeah. Rather than trying to do something.
You get to sit in circle with 4 people, dead or alive. Who are they? And what is the question you ask the circle?
It would include David Bohm, Jesus, Octavia Butler, Ursula Le Guin. She's a writer.
Gotcha. And what is the question you ask that circle of David Bohm, Jesus, Octavia Butler, and Ursula?
What is the purpose of humans in the ecosystem of the earth? I value the lenses of each of these people, some that are embedded in science fiction and imagining new worlds and new ways of being. And really, all 4 of them embodied that in their own way. They were able to play, with on the level of fiction or what we call science fiction, to reimagine the human in relationship to the earth and God and meaning, and allow themselves to live outside of the bounds of what is known.
The fun part about this question and the framing of the 4 people in circle and the one question you ask the circle is that I get to turn that question back to you. So what is the role of humans in our ecosystem?
I think that all beings have consciousness, and that human consciousness is different than all the others, but so is theirs. I mean, theirs is, who are we comparing? If I'm comparing, who is centric here? So I think there's a quality of consciousness that humans bring that speaks to even the evolution of life on this planet, as well as even universal or cosmic purposes. But really, I have to just sit in the unknowing. Part of it is the quality of awareness that humans bring. And I'd like to think about how humans in the future can be even more shaped by Earth's intelligence and kind of a new human, what a new human could look like. Out of that relationship. I might have a different answer in an hour, but
yeah. No, that's okay. What is one thing, maybe a mantra, an affirmation, maybe something else that you want everyone listening to this podcast to know?
You belong. Each of us belongs in the great web of life that includes each unique person. And so I think the mantra is I belong.
This one requires a little bit of homework from you. But who's one person that I should have on this podcast? And the homework part is you have to help me get them on.
Paulette Moore, someone I went to CJP with, and she's doing beautiful work in the world. She since CJP, she was led into a process of restoring her Mohawk identity and heritage. And that has completely led to a whole different frame of work. She's a filmmaker and artist, and has steeped herself in learning Mohawk language. And I think she could be a contribution to this conversation on restorative justice. The other person that I would recommend that might be harder to get on would be Bio Akamalafe, because his lens and his approach is just so radically different than kind of the traditional conversations that we have around justice.
And finally, how can people support you, your work, in the ways that you want to be supported?
I think if others are interested in this intersection of restorative justice and earthkeeping and relationship, and I would just love to have more conversations with people and to see what can come from that. So I would just say, if there's interest, to get in touch with me, and to have different things come out in every conversation I have with people. And so to see how we can broaden and expand this conversation, and how it can be rooted more deeply into both traditional restorative justice practices, as well as these offshoots of living out restorative justice with the earth in different ways. So just get in touch with me.
And what's the best way for people to do that?
My email, or you can visit my my website, which is actually any of them, but one of them is hagsophia.com. And you can be in touch that way, or Church of the Wild Shin Valley.com also has a place to put in your information to get in touch with me.
Beautiful. And we'll have those linked in the show notes for folks, along with the chapter. Thank you so much, Valerie, for sharing your stories, exploring these ideas, these radical ideas with us, and all the wisdom that comes from them. Thank you also for the invitation to slow down in all of this. Are there any other words that you want to leave the people with before we sign off?
Oh gosh, just trust your inner wisdom and go deeper, into your body, into what you experience, and trust that within you is and around you is the wisdom that you seek.
Beautiful. Well, thank you again, Valerie, so much. To everyone else who's listening, next week we'll be back with another episode in conversation with someone living this restorative justice life. Until then, take care, go deeper.
Thank you, David.
Thanks, Valerie. I really appreciated Valerie's focus not only on the relationship with yourself, not only on the relationship with others, but also our relationship with the earth. Another part of Indigenous practices that we don't often talk about on this podcast is the importance of honoring this earth that we live in, and also the food that we eat and the materials that we're using. And so it was really nice to feel grounded back in those Indigenous values. Valerie brought up some really important points this episode that I wanted to touch on. One of the things she said was, we are surrounded by intelligence that we don't access. Let me say it again. We are surrounded by intelligence that we don't access. This means that there are so many things in this world that we have not looked into, and that there are learning opportunities everywhere that we can and should tap into. I wanted to pose the question, what kinds of learning opportunities outside the classroom are we missing out on? And then I want to pose the question to you, what are you going to do to help seek outside learning opportunities? Additionally, I wanted to pose the question, what does caring for the world look like to you? Caring for the world is caring for other humans, but it's also caring for the soil that brings us food, for the air that helps us breathe, How do you care for the world every single day, just like it cares for you? As always, thank you so much for listening, and I can't wait to talk to you next week. Bye.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.